great to see so many new but so many familiar faces in the audience today. So this morning I'm going to share with you why I think the future of market researchers is looking at fast fashion or futurists. And the title of the presentation is Fast Fashion or Futurists, the Diverging Role of Market Research in Business. But first, before I begin, what I'd like to have you do is, if you are on Twitter, you can follow me or follow IIeX, or if you want a preview of what I'm speaking on, because we're going to cover quite a bit of slides quickly, you can check out futureofinsight.com and the article I wrote on this presentation that sort of walks you through a deeper dive on my thoughts. Okay, so as many of you know, one of the things that I've written quite a bit about over the years in market research is how we solve for the problem of acceleration. And what I mean by that is the acceleration in the rate of change in society, in business, generally in consumer demands, etc. And over the years, I've struggled with this challenge, thinking through this challenge, and in fact, that pushed me more towards the futures community, strategic foresight community. Now, my theory is that we, in the future, will have one of two paths as market researchers that we can go down. The first is what I call, in shorthand, the fast fashion path. And I'll walk you through this and unpack it in much more detail. But the idea here is basically all about externalizing the function and running near-time or real-time experiments with rapid product innovation. The second option, the second way that I think the profession will deal with the issue of acceleration, is embracing the futures community. Now, I'm not saying that we are going to eliminate traditional market research tools. Please don't misunderstand me there. What I'm saying is we're going to augment them with what's been done for 30, 40 years in the foresight community, in the futures community. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the problem of accelerating discontinuous change, because it's really a two-phase problem. It's not just that life is accelerating and the speed of business is accelerating. It's also that change itself is discontinuous. And so if I'm going to present to you today and talk about this, I owe you a little bit of background on why I make this claim. The first major point I want to make is that the metabolic rate of capitalism is quickening. I've written about this in other venues and spoken on this. So I have two data points that I want to show you that really, I think, are sort of the lead pipe cinch that explains why this is happening. If you look at the top, the first set of data on the top looks at the time it took from an invention, when it was invented, to then reach 25% U.S. market penetration. Now, the source is actually the Global Futures Trends 2030 report put out by the Directorate of National Intelligence here in the United States. And they argue that essentially innovation is accelerating at a very rapid pace. So you could see it took 46 years from invention of electricity to get into 25% of U.S. homes. And then you can see the trend line. The second is put out by a professor at Yale looking at the average lifespan of a company on the S&P 500. And what you could see here is the lifespan of a company in 1920 on the S&P 500 was 67 years. Today it's 18. So putting two and two together, it appears that the rate of change that we're getting in innovation is knocking out market incumbents faster and faster and creating quite a bit of disruptive change. And in terms of that disruptive change, and some of you have seen this before, but these are what I call the 10 Ds that are going to change your business. So we heard Campbell Soup talk this morning about looking 10 to 15 years out. That is correct. And we have to do it. And here are the 10 things that are going to change your business surely. The first is disruptive technology. So futurists talk about GRIN tech. That stands for genetics, robotics, internet, and nanotech, the four big players of the future. The second is this disruptive strategy idea, which is mostly associated with Clayton Christensen, the idea that you have to disrupt a market, which is, interestingly enough, why we're actually all here this morning. The third is digitization, which I think we're very familiar with. We can go on a hunt for bookstores later today, but I think it will largely be fruitless. The fourth is disintermediation. You've seen this with travel agents, with starting in the legal profession. I would argue in some respects with market research today. Dematerialization. You don't find many Gen Y with alarm clocks or watches anymore. They just look at their phone. Demonetization. Here, there are many examples of demonetization. Data, and when I've spoken on this before, I've pointed out that essentially data is a huge equalizer in many ways. It allows the attacker to actually catch up with the market incumbent faster and faster. Democratization. Separate presentation, but if you go back and you look at Mountain Dew's Democracy campaign, they essentially crowdsourced a flavor of soda just openly. Spigot is one of my favorite companies in this space, and they're out in Palo Alto. DIY, and what I mean by that is not DIY household, Home Depot, Lowe's. What I mean by this is the rise of 3D printers, which will eventually destabilize traditional manufacturing, movement beyond the job, and also eventually consumers buying and selling their own power when we reach grid parity for solar. And then finally, demography. Some of you have heard my presentations before. I've argued that essentially if your business is focused on the US, you're not going to get a lot of growth in the future. Every year we add the population of France to the global middle class, and the real action is going to be in the BRICS in the next 11. Okay, so one reaction to all of this, and sometimes it's a reaction I get, is to accept the premise that change is rapid and discontinuous, but it won't change my business. Now, luckily I think I've got a crowd that's open to what I'm going to say today, and I don't think we're going to go into denial. So the acceleration challenge, let's talk then a little bit more about this. I think I've basically made my point that we're seeing accelerating discontinuous change, but then what does that mean for market research? It means a couple things. One of my early challenges, this is about 5-6 years ago in the market research world, was when I started in market research, we would always tell clients, this survey is a snapshot in time. And then it came back to me when I was thinking, well, if we're giving people snapshots in time, but time is speeding up, how helpful are those snapshots? And then it occurred to me that perhaps we're actually in the car, in the driver's seat, but trying to drive the car looking out the driver's side window, basically looking at what's already almost passing us by, except that we're hitting the accelerator as we do this. And so this is a very serious problem for the business. And this is why I wrote the last chapter in Leading Edge Marketing Research, which is a big anthology of thinkers thinking about the future of where market research is headed. And I forecast 22 different plausible futures for the industry. In other presentations, I've isolated on one or two, but in this one, I'm actually trying to talk a little bit more about a specific fork in the road. So I gave a basic forecast in the book. And without getting into too much detail, because it's not the core of my presentation, I argue that there are basically 4 different eras of market research, beginning with data collection first, then moving to an observational era, then co-creative, and then finally anticipatory. And anticipatory is in many ways a code word for futures. And so we'll be talking about this as we go along. Now, there were 22 scenarios that I forecast in the book. I'm only going to be talking about 2. The 2 I wrote about that we're talking about today are what I called rhyming, which is rapid in-market experimentation, which I'm shorthanding for fast fashion because that's essentially what fast fashion and lean startup are doing. And the second is anticipation, which I'm shorthanding as futurists. So let's talk a little bit about what we can learn as an industry from fast fashion. No one has ever actually accused me of being anywhere near a fashion plate, so this is a little bit outside my zone, but I will sort of walk you through the thinking here. So market research is basically built on a think-do model, right? That there's planning and there's execution, and we are a stage in that process, usually on the front end and then on the feedback side. Okay. But fast fashion and lean startup essentially flip this model. And they actually go from think, do to do, think. And they say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to run rapid in-market experiments, and we're going to learn from those experiments, and then we're just going to keep iterating and keep iterating. Now, I stumbled across this years ago because I happened to run into someone who was in the fashion industry talking to me about Charming Charlie and talking to me about Zara. So it was sort of a stranger in a restaurant kind of a situation. It's a great story. And that's the only reason I stumbled into any of this and then wrote it into the book. But essentially, they've turned the market research sort of paradigm on its head. So instead of sort of doing planning and thinking at the beginning, they're actually pushing product into the market and running that as an experiment and then learning. I think there's a lot that we can learn from that. So, how many have been to Charming Charlie? Let me see a show of hands. Okay, all right. Funny, I was on vacation with my wife and children in Florida, and we were walking down the street, and there was a Charming Charlie, and I ran into the store. And my wife was like, why are we in Charming Charlie? I said, no, this is for work. You've got to understand. They're doing something fascinating here. And so I ended up quizzing the owner for about 20 minutes, much to the chagrin of my wife. And then Zara, of course, I'm sure, how many people have been into Zara? Okay, lots. Okay, great. So you understand, it's very rapid turnover. They're running a lot of fast experiments. Charming Charlie has an even faster turnover than Zara in their stores. I mean, they're churning that merchandise so fast and running experiments on it. It's fairly amazing. Okay, so that's fast fashion and what we can learn from fast fashion in a nutshell. But now I want to talk about futures. And again, this gets back to when a snapshot in time can't get you ahead of the curve. And I had to use the Polaroid. Okay, so this is my thinking on how we as an industry will end up absorbing some strategic foresight and futures work into our practice. And you heard the speaker from Campbell Soup already talk about this. Institute for the Future in Palo Alto is a very well-known institute. When I first became engaged with the futures community about 4 to 5 years ago and started writing a little bit on this topic, I came across an article that was absolutely eye-opening. So the people on your right, last names are Irvine and Schwartzbach, and they work at the Naval Air Warfare Center in China Lake. And they were actually tasked with trying to figure out and forecast the future of weapons and war. And they were looking heavily at technology. But as they did this project, they realized that actually all of their forecasting about technology had an amazing sort of consumer and social implications. And so they asked the government if they could actually write this report just on the regular civilian applications of all these technologies and what that would do to society. And they got the green light. And then they published their work, which was, well received, but not well covered. It was written up in the Futurist magazine and some various articles. And they project a couple different ages. And they argue essentially that the information age is in full swing, but almost beginning to end, and that we'll be entering the robotic biotech age fairly soon, and that will change very many things. If you think about the movement from the post-industrial age to the information age, it was a massive shift. And they argue essentially the same thing. They also, interestingly enough, buried in the report, argue that the social composition of society will dramatically change. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about discontinuous change and how we have to use futures work and futurists to get ahead of the curve. And this is a little bit hard to read, but we can distribute my presentation later. But if you look on the right, they actually project out what the social structure of the robotic biotech age will look like. One of the challenges they have, which is one of the challenges implicit in the books Race Against the Machine and Who Owns the Future, is technological unemployment. That there may be a class of individuals who are simply not able to hold a job in the future because they do not have the cognitive capacity or the skills to compete, and they'll have to become wards of the state, for example. And they also discuss the issue of a gulf in society between haves and have-nots, between the cognitive elite and everyone else. And you could see this reflected in what they think this social structure will look like. just to give you a sense, both they and Race Against the Machine and the Global Trends 2030 report put out by DNI all look at this issue of what happens if you have algorithms dislocate white-collar workers and robotics dislocate blue-collar workers rapidly. And I think that's going to happen. And as marketers, we have to think about how we adjust to that very changed and fractured future. I think in addition to this, and this is what I'll close with, we've talked about how we can iterate rapidly using this do, think, fast fashion model, but we've also talked about how we can use the classical think, do futurist model. But if we think about this, there are essentially three big changes that we have to navigate and help our companies and businesses navigate in the future. And I'm going to walk through each of these really quick with the time I have. Got what, 5 minutes? 0 minutes. Okay. Three ones. The first is enoughness. You've seen this all over the place. And there have been a couple writers that write on this, where people feel like they have simply had enough and they don't need any more. That's a challenge if we're trying to sell them more things. You see this in the simplicity movement. You see this all over the place. The second one, which is related but not entirely the same, is collaborative consumption. I find this to be one of the most interesting social changes. There's a book, What's Yours is Mine, et cetera, and there's a lot of discussion about collaborative models here. And that's a challenge to any of our business models that are selling one product to one person for one extended use. And then finally, prosumers. Prosumers is talking about, and this is used in two ways. Prosumers is defining consumers who actually produce themselves and sell into the system. You know, you're starting to see this on Etsy, for example. But it also is used as shorthand for consumers who are actually for something. And if you want to take a look at something that's going to make our lives very interesting, look at the app Buycott. It's just gotten some play, and it essentially allows shoppers to scan an item and learn all about the ownership of the company that's marketing that product and whether they agree with that company's stance or not. So, thank you very much for your time, and I hope this is helpful. If you want to follow up with me, feel free, and you can also take a look at futureofinsight.com for more detail.